So I'm going to focus in on political virtue today. And Hauerwas asked a very interesting question in this chapter, Virtue in Public. Where is virtue to be found, if anywhere? Is it in our politicians? Is it in our religious people, leaders, or common people who are religious? Where is it? And what does it look like? Now, he does say virtue in politicians is possible, kind of reminded me of what Hans Morgenthau said a long time ago in books like Politics Amongst Nations or Scientific Man versus Power Politics. Morgenthau's a great read, even now. Hauerwas talks about the dirty hands phenomenon, which is that when political leaders, Democrat or otherwise, are involved in making decisions, the reality is that their hands will have to get dirty. And the real question is whether in doing that, they themselves will become dirty. In other words, will they become bad people? And we know that politics is extremely corrupting and that the power is very corrupting. And so most of them apparently cannot withstand this and actually maintain virtue in this space. But he says, if dirty hands are unavoidable in the political realm, then we can only trust to such offices those who can recognize the moral ambiguity of much of what they must do without thereby excusing their actions in the name of politics. That is, they can't excuse their own actions in the name of politics. This is so tough to be able to do something that you know is necessary, but that you also know is wrong, and not to excuse the wrongness of it. And in maintaining this tension, Hauerwas is saying that is the only way that a politician can show restraint and can actually make the best decision in very difficult circumstances. He says, this is not only because otherwise the political would be corrupting for the person of virtue, but more importantly, we would otherwise abandon the political to a cynicism that would reduce politics to nothing more than a clash of power. And I think we would agree, probably almost all of us would agree, that politics for the most part has been long reduced to nothing more than a clash of power, and that the type of leader who can actually maintain a sense that he's doing something that's morally mixed and that his hands are dirty is a rare politician. Either they excuse themselves and say, well, that's just the way it has to be, and then they become corrupted and they're not particularly troubled by it, or they lie to themselves and deny that they're doing anything wrong at all and that their hands are dirty at all, and everything they do is righteous and in fact aligned with God's design. And so, very, very few people live up to this notion that Hauerwas has, and he knows it. Now, he addresses democratic virtue in particular here, and he says, I don't believe that intrinsic to the nature of democracy is a downplaying of the significance of virtue. That is, I do not believe it if democracy is understood as a system of social relations and institutions to encourage the discussion necessary for the articulation of the good a people can share in common. That's a long-winded way of saying, basically, that virtue can be displayed in democracy, but only if the democracy is kind of like an ideal Greek polis, in which all the people involved in making the decision, and in a real democracy, that's all the citizens and then their leaders. And ideally, there is a give and take and discussion with the aim of achieving the common good. So in that rarefied and idealistic definition of democracy, which I'm sure Hauerwas would prefer, but he knows it doesn't exist, then you could have virtue. Now, you see how cynical of a statement that really is, or skeptical, or whatever you want to call it. Hauerwas is basically saying he doesn't believe that in the real world, virtue and democracy is hardly ever possible, okay? That this articulation of the good, the common good, does not happen in real world democracies that he knows. So he says the question, however, is whether such an understanding of democracy is even a possibility in a society like ours. Moreover, such a view of democracy is no longer articulated even in our theories of democracy. So it is not even any longer held out as an imaginative ideal. Who gets taught in grade school, junior high, or high school in the United States or other democratic, liberal democratic countries, ostensibly, that politics is about deliberating with our fellow citizens for the common good? Do you get taught what a citizen is, what a citizen should be? So at one point, I think this was probably taught in our civics classes as a sort of ideal to live up to, but I don't even recall getting that message, and I don't recall my son getting that message in school, and I bet that many of you didn't get that message in school, or if you did, it was treated as some sort of just phrase that wasn't emphasized. In other words, we aren't taught that being a citizen is anything more than thinking of our own self-interest, and if somebody begs you enough times to vote, maybe voting, but in your self-interest as you kind of perceive it lumped into whatever interest group that you happen to identify with. So again, Hauerwas is pretty realistic. Now, then he turns to the church, and this is a statement that I found very intriguing, okay? He says, yet if the church, which is after all a public institution, can be the kind of community that manifests the political significance of virtue, then the church may well have a political function not often realized. Uh-oh, what does that mean? Is Hauerwas on the side of basically the politicization of the church? No, I don't think so. But if you just read that statement, you might wonder, is this where he's going? Is he going to talk about, political activism either on the left or on the right? I guess for him, it would probably be on the left. Is he going to advocate, that basically churches turn into arms of the Democratic Party? No, he doesn't do that, which makes you wonder, what does he mean by the possibility of the church as a public institution being a kind of community that manifests the political significance of virtue, harking back to that idea of the polis, the community in which people deliberate with each other and compromise with each other to effect the common good. What does that mean when it comes to a church, an institution that now has been hollowed out and is kind of dead in our society, because it's about mainly it's just about kind of performing worship in a performative way and being forgiven in a sort of performative way, and maybe doing some charitable work, or at least giving in the direction of charitable work. But one can't really call it a community. And I mean that even if there's, study groups and small groups and things like that. I want to really emphasize, those are not communities full bore. We really misuse the term community, okay, a lot. Do these people rely on each other for more than hollow emotional support every once in a while? Usually not. And so in order to create a real community in which there would be concern for the common good, because there would be a common good that could be defined, those folks would have to do a lot more actual life together. That happens sometimes, but I would posit in most churches, it's probably pretty rare, because of our very individualistic culture. We don't even rely on our families very much, ideally, unless we really have to. Why would we rely on people from a church? So Hauerwas sort of clarifies by saying that the church cannot do this sort of political activity that he imagines could express political virtue by engaging in the politics of force. So if I'm reading him right, that rules out the use of the church as a sort of political wing of the Democratic or Republican Party or some other party. It rules out primarily looking at the church as a vehicle for getting some sort of legislation passed, or changing the national economy somehow through legislation or any number of things like that. That's what he means by the politics of force, because you're basically going to work to utilize the power of the state to make everybody live the way you want, whether it's to not have abortions or whether it's to pay for more welfare programs or whatever it is. That's the use of force, because it's aiming at change that comes from not so much from like people actually practicing change with each other in community, but it comes from being made to do so by the state or receive some sort of penalty. The full power of the state is going to be wielded against you. This is not the type of politics that Hauerwas is talking about when it comes to the church. We're so used to thinking of politics as aiming in this type of direction that it's hard to even grasp how he could be using politics to describe something else. But he's talking about, I think, a community of people deliberating with each other. And maybe when it comes to churches, that means even at the national level or at a larger level, maybe a global level. In the case of the Catholic Church, that would be true. Orthodox Church as well. Okay, and many other Protestant denominations as well. They have a global arm, thinking about how they want to organize themselves in order to do things for each other and others in community. This doesn't happen very often, right? So what he says is that church should stand within our society, making present what would otherwise be absent. Now, the reason why I have this emoji up there is because I was really expecting Hauerwas to tell us how that should be done, okay? Because I myself have some ideas on how that should be done. But I expected to read from him how that might be done, and it just sort of gets dropped in there and then left. So what exactly that looks like, how a church community would become more of a community, not an outreach wing of a charity, not a wing of a political party, but actually a group of people that you could rely on, How's that happen? He doesn't tell us, and that's a bit frustrating, but I hope over time that I can, try to think this out for myself and share some of those thoughts with you. And I would really like to hear any experience that you have had in this regard as well. He says that churches should not promote a return to Republican virtues, meaning small r Republican, as in, the type of virtues of the citizen engaged in the community of fellow citizens. They should not promote a return to that small r Republican virtue while at the same time advocating a capitalist system, which clearly seems to undermine those very virtues. Capitalist system does undermine those virtues of self-reliance, family, extended family, being able to care for yourself, your family, and your community on your own to a certain extent, valuing those closest and nearest to you. It does do that. And so he's not saying that church should be anti-capitalist, but to advocate for capitalism as a solution to anything is a weird sort of self-contradiction, because it breaks up those very smaller institutions that can help us, including the church. It breaks up the church. It reorients its message. It divides the people and separates them. It gets them in so many different directions outside of the church. The church just becomes something that you do every once in a while on Sunday. He says, how does one seek one's own interest economically, yet think that the public good may require us to qualify that interest? There's such a thrust, there's such a focus on self-interest and the pursuit of profit. How can we expect those people to step back to be a good citizen, whether at the political level or at the level of church or other lower level civic institution or religious institution? It's a tough thing to ask, but that's what people are asked to do when they hear somebody preach about how they should be virtuous. All right. I will see you next week when I hope we'll have more on this. Bye.